Hello, everyone, and welcome to History Matters, the podcast of the Canadian Institute for Historical Education. I'm your host, Allan Williams. Today is August 14th, 2025, and my guest today is Sean Conway. Sean Conway studied Canadian history at Wilfrid Laurier and Queen's Universities, and, as I just learned yesterday, was just about to head off to Duke University to do his doctorate when his historical career was interrupted by his election as the MPP from Renfrew in 1975. He served 28 years in the Ontario legislature until 2003, since which time he has taught history at Queen's, the University of Toronto, and Toronto Metropolitan University. And, most relevant to our conversation today, Sean served as the Minister of Education in the David Peterson Liberal government of Ontario from 1985 to 1990. Sean, welcome to the podcast.
Delighted to be here and delighted particularly to be under your careful tutelage, Allan.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. Sean, I should say, is a member of the Board of Directors of the Canadian Institute for Historical Education, and it's been a real pleasure to get to know Sean over these past year and a half or 2 years. So I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
As am I.
Okay. Well, as we discussed, we like to open with what we're calling context matters. And that's kind of a mantra that we have that whenever we're talking about something related to Canadian history, it's interesting to look at not just the episode itself, but what's the context that helps us understand that. So let's go back to something that happened 40 years ago in June 26th, 1985. You were sworn in as part of the David Peterson government and as Minister of Education in that government after a long period of progressive conservative government. So that was at the end of June, and ministers were sworn in, as I said, on June 26th. But as much as a month before that, you started receiving briefings from the government related to an issue, and that's a little bit unusual. So why don't you tell us how to explain that and put that in context?
Well, yes, the circumstances of Ontario's provincial political scene in the late winter and spring of 1985 were quite unusual in this respect that a provincial election was called by the new Conservative Premier, Frank Miller, at the end of March for May the 2nd, because Mr. Premier William Davis had retired after a very long and distinguished career as Premier, the second longest Premier in the province's history from 1971 till he announced his retirement in the fall of 1984. There had been a Conservative leadership race, and Frank Miller, who was a senior minister in the Davis government, won a hotly contested race and formed a government and called an election because they were well into their fourth year of the Davis mandate on March 25th for May 2nd. It was widely expected when Premier Miller won the leadership and called that election based on polling and a variety of other indicators that the Progressive Conservatives, at that point, 42 years into their dynastic rule, Ontario has had a liking for dynastic rules. The Conservatives in the 20th century, the Liberals actually had their dynasty in the mid and late 19th century from 1871 till 1905. But at any rate, Frank Miller was leading in the polls by 20 points over the Liberals, and the NDP were in third place. And the talk actually was not who was going to win that election when it was called, but would Bob Rae, the new wunderkind who came from Ottawa to lead the provincial NDP, would he overtake the David Peterson Liberals? Well, that's not what happened. I mean, talk about a surprise. A big surprise was after the 38 days of the election campaign or whatever, we essentially had a hung parliament. And a hung parliament is essentially where, you almost have a tie. On election night, I remember on May the 2nd, at around 9:15, if you were watching television, it was the shock and awe of Tories 50, Liberals 50, NDP trailing with 25. Now that's settled down by the end of the night to give the Conservatives 52, the Liberals 48, the NDP 25. But the Liberals had one percentage more of the popular vote, 38% to 37%. So a huge surprise. And the Miller government was still resolving the leadership race. So Premier Davis had announced about a year before, in June of 1984, to great surprise, that as he was heading out the door, he had changed a lifetime personal position of opposing any separate school extension beyond what had already existed. He made a very definitive statement before he called his first election as premier in 1971 that, there was a separate stream in Ontario education, but it would go no further, notwithstanding the fact, to be fair to Mr. Davis and Premier Robarts, that a number of very important, enhancements to separate school financing at the elementary level had been, in fact, provided by the Davis-Robarts administration, particularly in the 1960s, and the so-called foundation plan. At any rate, Mr. Davis stood up on the 12th of June without notice and without really anybody in the cabinet except Roy McMurtry and Tom Wells knowing anything about what was coming, and certainly nobody in the caucus knew what was coming. And wow, a long-standing fundamental platform for the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party got reversed because Premier Davis had changed his mind. And what he did that I still find puzzling, because Mr. Davis was a very shrewd politician, and he knew the education brief really well because he, like his Secretary of the Cabinet, had both been at the Department of Education. Mr. Davis was Minister of Education during the very buoyant, expansionary period of the 1960s. He knew this file really, really well. So when he made the announcement and therefore joined the other two parties who had been supportive of separate school extension for the last 3 years, basically grades 11, 12, and 13, and grade 13 was being phased out during that period of time, there was an apparent unanimity of the main parties on an issue that had been very, very controversial from the middle of the 19th century. So Mr. Davis would have known that he was riding a third rail of Ontario politics for all the political parties, but particularly the Conservative Party, because they had been basically in support of a one-stream Ryersonian, the famous Dr. Ryerson, who was the Minister of Education for 30 years in the 19th century, essentially knew that there was a provision for some measure of separate schooling, but not something that was going to be fully competitive with that national stream of Ryerson's educational policy. At any rate, when that happened, there was shock and awe around the place. And one of the big surprises for me was that he didn't then, that is Mr. Davis, have in the other hand enabling legislation. I mean, you rarely get, I was in the legislature for nearly 30 years. I have never seen somebody get up, reverse himself on a major policy like that, especially for his own party, and join the other parties, but they were permanent opposition parties, it basically seemed. So there appeared all of a sudden to be unanimity. And if you were ever going to do it, it struck me that having made the announcement, I would have expected him to say, oh, by the way, here's the enabling legislation. Because I think I've said to you, Allan, when I was there watching all of this, I thought, well, this is clear that Mr. Davis is going to retire. And he had every right to retire. He was, at that point, 25 years a member, 14 years a premier, very distinguished record. And so I thought, and he knew this education file like few people around. And he knew this. I mean, he said in retirement that there were few more fundamental issues in Ontario politics than this question of denominational schools, that in the 19th century didn't focus entirely on Roman Catholics. The Anglicans and some Presbyterians and some others had always the right under the Common School Act of 1841 to opt out of the main school program and set up their separate system, usually on a faith-based reason. But anyway, he didn't introduce the legislation. So he made the announcement. Then he retired and left the issue sitting out there for 13 months. And I can tell you, those 13 months were much more consequential than I think any of us realized that day on the 12th of June, 1984. And
well, before we leave the immediate context, it's right that the separate school funding at the time went to grade 10 and public school funding went through to grade 13.
It was the complete, the public non-denominational system, which is what Dr. Ryerson imagined. And he based it on basically the Irish system of a non-denominational school system. But when one says non-denominational, what one has to understand in the early days or the 21st century that there was no such a thing as a non-sectarian system, because there was religion was really important to people in certainly British North America in the 19th century. So that the average person could not imagine that there would not be a very significant moral surround to whatever the curriculum offered. And by that moral surround, a deeply Christian surround. And that's where the problem arose, because, the Reformation split Christendom. But within the Protestant community, you had the Anglicans, you had the Presbyterians, who had themselves in the 1840s, right after the Union Parliament was established in 1841, they had a major split between the reformist Free Kirk Presbyterians, who broke from the established Church of Scotland, basically the Anglicans in Scotland. And one of the big differences between those branches of Presbyterianism is that the Free Kirk reformers thought there should be no connection between state and church, especially on things like education. They strongly believed in a religious component in education, but that should be between the faith community and the parents who, if they wanted it, could pay for it separate and apart from any public funding. George Brown, who became incredibly important in that period of time in the 1850s, 1860s, was the most powerful politician in Ontario, and he had the most powerful organ in the country, the Toronto Globe. And if you really want to entertain yourself, you should read the gallons of paint that you can find on the Globe editorial pages from about just about the time the Globe was established in 1844, but it really got ratcheted up in the 1850s and 60s. I mean, what he did not have to say negatively about separate schools was hardly fit to print.
Well, just before we get too much into the earlier period, a couple more questions about the more recent one, which is what role do you think this issue played in the May 2nd, 1985 election? And then once we've talked about that, let's talk about the briefings that you were getting before you were sworn as a minister.
Well, that's a very good question, and I'll try to be more focused and somewhat briefer in answering it. The election was what nobody expected, and what we'd never seen in an Ontario provincial election in the post-Confederation period. Basically, a hung parliament that it was a 125 seat legislature, so you needed 63 votes to form a majority government. Frank Miller was the incumbent premier. He had every right to meet the new legislature elected by that May 2nd election, but he had to get 13 other votes to carry anything. And the Liberals were at 48, and the seats, and the NDP with their new leader, Bob Rae, were at 25. So if you added the Liberals and the Conservatives, you got 72 seats, and the Conservatives had 52. So Miller faced immediately after the election real pressure from people. The Conservatives lost, I think, 20 seats in that election. And a lot of those members, I can remember talking to them. I was close to a number of them, and they said that separate school issue really hurt. And it hurt because Davis, both because of how important that issue was, especially for the voting public in Ontario, but it was a core issue for progressive conservatives. And they got no notice that, the man who in 1971 made the definitive case as to why you would never do it without notice did it. And then within the year, the party was going into a general election. So what I submit happened is, and I think the evidence supports me in this, that Davis, in doing what he did, the way he did it, it was a big, big surprise. He cracked the Tory base. You can argue how deeply he cracked it, but he cracked it without question. And then when Frank Miller took over as premier, Frank was a very good guy, but Frank's it was a business guy from Bracebridge, a good guy, but this was not his bread and butter. And then he said the morning after the election, well, all bets are off. The electorate has told us, that this is a problem. And Miller was getting great pressure from his own caucus, particularly the defeated members, that we've got to read this signal and get out of this commitment. And that also then started to energize the opposition. Oh my goodness, are we going to have another election based on a reversal of the conservative policy as presented on this topic by Davis a year ago? And that had a real effect of galvanizing the Liberals and the New Democrats to what they eventually did, come together and formed an accord and presented that to the Lieutenant Governor after a non-confidence motion was introduced and passed that defeated the Miller government about 6 weeks after the election.
Well, before the non-confidence motion, though, you received a word from David Peterson asking you to go and have a meeting. Can you tell us about that story?
Yeah, that's a good story, and I'll try to tell it quickly. So I had not been involved. I was involved in other aspects of policy for the Liberal opposition. I was not the education critic. I was the critic for higher education, universities and colleges. But Jim Bradley, our longtime member from St. Catharines, a former public school teacher, was the education critic. But after the election, this thing really, the separate school issue and how it was going to be dealt with now was front and center. And it was because it involved, religion and politics. Boy, that's always a very dangerous mix. So about 10 days after the election, my friend and leader, David Peterson, said, I want to see you in my office. And I went over to see him, and he said, I want you to go and see Ed Stewart, the cabinet secretary, who had been with Davis for many, many years and had been Davis's deputy minister of education before he became the top bureaucrat in the Ontario Public Service. Very knowledgeable, very, very professional public servant, Ed Stewart, who, by the way, did not agree, we now know, with Mr. Davis's decision of June 12th, 1984. And I said to Mr. Peterson, well, what am I going to be doing? And he said, Dr. Stewart will explain what's going on here. And he said it with a kind of a smile. So off I went. And by the way, at this point, I was already on the Liberal committee after the election, when it looked like there was going to have to be some unusual and prolonged negotiation. So how are we going to resolve this political issue? It's basically a hung parliament. So both Liberals and New Democrats, the Liberals and the Conservatives started to seriously court the NDP. Each party established a little committee of 3 or 4. Bob Nixon, Ian Scott, and I were the Liberal committee with Mr. Peterson's chief of staff, Herschel Ezrin. So I was already going to meetings to see whether or not there was enough to get the NDP together with the Liberals to give the lieutenant governor, should the occasion arise, as it did. Well, here's an alternate government. If the Miller government is defeated, we believe this is a very credible alternate government. And we outlined, a detailed policy agenda where we had campaigned on on the same issues with more or less the same positions. So I go to see Ed Stewart, and I said, well, nice to see you, Dr. Stewart. And he, very professionally, he said, we are in unusual times, and Premier Miller has spoken to Mr. Peterson, and given the timetable that Mr. Davis had set out the year before, he very carefully, in June of 84, said that there is going to be, under our plan, a 3-year phase-in, because we're looking at grade 11, grade 12, and grade 13. As long as it existed, they would now get full funding, but only at a year at a time, and the first phase-in would start in September of 1985. This is 15 months after he's making the announcement in June of 84. But we're now in June of 85, and there's no legislation. So Dr. Stewart said to me, Mr. Premier Miller and Mr. Peterson agreed that given that timetable, because the whole education community had seen a unanimity, apparently, a 3-party agreement. So yes, there's no legislation, but clearly they're going to do this. And they started to make the adjustments. So Dr. Stewart said, the feeling is that somebody in the official opposition should start getting briefed up on, the options of how you might do this.
I'm guessing it gave you some idea who the next education minister might be.
Well, that thought did cross my mind. I remember thinking, oh, God, and then that's before the briefings began. Well, I started, and Ed Stewart was very good. He said, you can bring a couple of your researchers with you, and if you need people other than the senior people at education, like the Attorney General's folks or whomever, we are quite happy to make that possible. However, here's a minister's, confidentiality agreement you have to sign. And I shook and I signed it, and off I went to, I think there must have been, 8, 10, 12 of those briefings over the next 4 or 5 weeks. And I became progressively more, terrified as I got further and further into this. And Allan, I had been a member of the legislature at this point for 10 years. I've felt I was pretty knowledgeable. I had a good university education. I realized very early on that I knew nothing about how the executive department, cabinet government actually functioned. And I also knew that this was going to be one very thorny question. And we were, if we did form a government, whoever formed a government was in a very, very minority situation. And I just sat there and I thought to myself, wow, if I had thought when this election campaign began that I would be right afterwards involved in 2 processes. One, the Accord discussions, quite frankly, were very positive, very congenial. It looked, Frank Miller, who was a very genial guy, was not feeling very well, I think, up in Kapuskasing the last 24 hours of the campaign. And in a way that was unlike Frank, but I know what it's like when the campaign is not going the way you want it to. He just happened to say that, you got to watch that NDP because they're a political party that sometimes thrives on misery and hate. And I remember the day he said that, he was on his way to Pembroke, which is where I lived in Eastern Ontario. I thought, oh boy, if there's a minority government here, and I think there's going to be, that's not a calling card to state. But anyway, it was, and I think, and I don't want to boast, but I doubt if there was another situation where somebody was effectively getting briefed like a minister 4 or 5 weeks before there was any government to which that person belonged. And I would come back, Ian Scott, who was newly elected, one of Canada's most distinguished lawyers, and ironically, whose great-grandfather played a critical role in the development of and the constitutional protection of Roman Catholic separate schools in Ontario in the 1860s, was elected as a Liberal MPP for Toronto, Rosedale, basically. And I thought, well, if there's a Liberal government, Scott is almost certainly going to be the Attorney General. So I kind of broke my confidence because I'd come back from these briefings. Scott was in my office because he was looking for space, and we were all told, you may be moving again. You've been around Queen's Park. Allan, you know what it's like after an election. There's always a big fight, even if there's no change of government. Well, who's going to get the good offices? And so Scott I'd come back and he'd be there, and I'd say this has to be very confidential, and I would be describing some of the choices that we're facing us. And God bless him, and he's been dead now for several years, but he'd say, well, we just won't do that. And I said, no, Ian, it doesn't work like that. We've made a commitment to do this. And a lot of people who've only known opposition are going to find out that yours truly leading among them, that life is a bit more complicated than being an opposition member when you just have to sort of say what's wrong with what the current government is doing without understanding the complexities, the nuances, the constraints of actually making the government train run on time to a destination that you're advertising. So that 6 weeks was like no other 6 weeks in my life. And I remember when the government changed on that sunny afternoon, I think it was a Thursday, June 26, 1985, we had an open air swearing in on the lawn of Queen's Park. It for me was just a little break in what seemed like a month-long, like a monk sequestered in the darkest, well, not the darkest part of the monastery, but I would just go from one briefing to the next and be thinking, how are we going to do this? And it was quite a memorable experience. And I will say one thing. When I was a grad student at Queen's, I was elected right out of grad school 10 years before. I took a course, a wonderful graduate course in Canada in the Union period from a great professor, became a real friend and mentor of mine, Donald Swainson. It was one of the best courses I've ever taken, and it focused on Canada in the Union period. That period of Canadian history after, particularly the Canadas then, Ontario and Quebec. This is before Confederation, but Ontario and Quebec from 1841 to 1867. And I got to tell you, I really, really enjoyed that course, never ever thinking that when I became a minister of the Crown, nothing would be more useful than the history class that I took that explained to me the really interesting elements of the Union period, where Ontario and Quebec were put together in a forced marriage by the imperial government. There was no upper tier and lower tier. There was no independence as there had been before the rebellions. There was the separate colony of Upper Canada, the separate colony of Lower Canada. That all ended after the rebellions. The imperial government said, we're going to put this pair together. We're going to proceed on a policy of forced assimilation of French Canadians. We're going to introduce some democracy, which was essentially that the cabinet would start to be reflective of the legislative assembly. And if the cabinet couldn't get the support of the legislature, it ceased being a government. So this was a very changed circumstance. But anyway, I'll tell you something, that no briefing I got, and I got many, many briefings, all of them very helpful. None were as good as just remembering what I had been taught in that class, that first of all, this denominational school issue, especially in Ontario, was very, very toxic. Denominational schools in the beginning weren't just for Roman Catholics. The Anglicans were there, some of the Presbyterians were there, but it had to be remembered that after 1841, Ontario and Quebec were together in one harness.
Minority school rights have been an important issue throughout Canadian history. So
they've been important and generally controversial. If you get outside of the province of Canada in this period, that is 1841, 1867, you can look at Manitoba when Confederation is established, almost, in the first inning of that new parliamentary business. There were protections written into the Manitoba Act that were in fact effectively withdrawn by the provincial government in Manitoba, partly because there was a big influx of Anglophones from Ontario into the new province. There was very good farmland in particularly southern Manitoba, southwestern Manitoba. So that original colony, the Louis Riel community, the Métis, there were French Canadians there. There was a worry that there was going to be a big influx of Americans after the American Civil War. And then later on in that the early 20th century, when the provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan were created, the federal government of Wilfrid Laurier decided it was going to entrench separate schools in the so-called autonomy bills, and that caused a huge crisis in the federal government in 1904, 5, and 6. Clifford Sifton, a very powerful minister in that government, resigned over Laurier's effort to entrench essentially French Catholic schools in Western Canada. That was quickly Anglicizing, if that's a proper word.
The era that you're talking about when you were the minister it's a fascinating story, and so thank you for telling us about it. You've written a paper on this, which includes some background on the from the earlier constitutional discussions in the 19th century. Can you tell us, that paper is going to be published, I understand, by U of T as part of a book about the 40th anniversary. Can you tell us briefly about that?
The Peterson years have not really attracted a lot of attention, partly, I think, because the government was created in surprising circumstances, like nobody saw it coming. And then it was created and got off to, a pretty good start. I mean, people thought, well, I wonder how these birds, they haven't been in office, and, well, nobody could remember. Bob Nixon was the elder statesman of our caucus, and his father had been the last Liberal premier, but that was 40-some years ago. And so how are they going to do? One of the things that Ontarians always look to in their provincial government is what's their ability to manage the economy, manage, sensitive, complicated things. And not to sound too self-congratulatory, but, after a while, Peterson certainly seemed to hit a good stride. And but this separate school thing had the potential of, dividing each of the three political parties. But then we won a very strong second mandate that got primarily focused on the Meech Lake Accord, big constitutional debate that Brian Mulrooney undertook with David Peterson's very active support to see if we could bring Quebec back into the constitutional agreement that René Lévesque had rejected because of what he felt was the unfriendly behavior of the Anglophone premiers, particularly Ontario and Alberta. They certainly, he didn't feel acted very welcomingly. And then free trade. And then the government basically got soundly defeated in that our second election as a government in September of 1990. So anyway, 40 years later, there was some discussion around the University of Toronto and elsewhere. Well, it would be good to get a book about those Peterson years. There may not be a lot of interest, but the Ontario government used to sponsor something called the Ontario Historical Series, and so they do a biography of Leslie Frost and his very successful premiership, and they do one on John Robarts. And so the idea basically begins over at the University of Toronto, because David Peterson became a very successful chancellor of the University of Toronto. And I know the former president was very keen to do something to recognize that. And he started a bit of a campaign. Well, what about, the U of T getting involved and helping, arrange a number of, seminars to look back on that period and, the sort of thing you would do to review the mandate, admittedly, in this case, well after, this is now 40 years after that government ceased to be in office. But anyway, there was quite a lot of interest. And so the University of Toronto Press has gotten involved, and they're quite keen to publish a volume of essays from academics and some practitioners about what went down during that period, what worked, what didn't work, how do you explain such a dramatic rise, particularly after the 1987 election, when we went from having 48 seats to the 1987 election, where we won 95 seats. I mean, should never get that many seats, and then we fell out of the sky, a bit like the Lesage government in Quebec in 1966.
So your paper is going to be part of that book, and we can expect that in about a year, I understand?
If everything goes well, I'd done a first draft of a chapter tentatively called The Separate School Issue and the Change of Government in Ontario, 1984, 1987. And it's twice as long as I can have it. So I'm going to have to bring it back down to about 7,500 words. So yes, that's the expectation.
Well, that's great. And thank you for telling us about this interesting anecdote and the context behind it. So in the few minutes we have left, I want to turn to two other questions briefly. The first is, how did you get interested in Canadian history or history in general in the first place?
Well, that's a very easy question to answer. I grew up in a small town in the Upper Ottawa Valley, a place called Barry's Bay, a lumber community just south of Algonquin Park, a couple of hours northwest of Ottawa, about three hours and a bit northeast of Toronto. A lumber family, an Irish Catholic family. That was something I remembered. I remember when I became Minister of Education, I had my first scrum on the day I was sworn in as minister. Hal Vincent, who was a great guy, was a long time really good guy from CFRB. And he basically said, well, Conway, as a Catholic, how can you be considered fair-minded about this new job you've got? And I said, well, Hal, you're just going to have to watch and see what I do. I can understand how people might think that, but it was just a good reminder that, I better walk carefully. But my mother's father, Thomas Patrick Murray, born in the Ottawa Valley frontier, West Renfrew County, 1880, lived to be 102, less a few weeks. And I agree, he was a presence, a real presence in my life. And he was always talking, he was 31 when I died. So, he would be going on. And he was for 16, 17 years a member of the legislature in the wild and wacky years of Mitch Hepburn and Howard Ferguson and George Drew and the Depression and the war and Adam Beck and all that stuff. And I had no idea what he was talking about, these stories, but they were the most interesting stories of anybody in my circle. I wish I could tell you that I understood what they were. I didn't, but I thought, wow, this is really interesting stuff. And this in state old Ontario, I'm telling you, his stories about Mitchell Hepburn and Howard Ferguson. Now, they never met, but if they had, I don't think we would have needed Darlington, because they were two really colorfully kinetic people. So basically, it was family. It was just listening to an old man at our table on Sunday evenings for family dinners, and he would be going on about, when he wasn't talking about his baseball career or his lumber company, about those days at Queen's Park. And of course, my grandmother, his wife, did not have anything good to say about politics, and so that's where I was bitten.
Wonderful.
It was also how I got interested in politics, but also how I got interested in history, because you had to go and read a few books about this. Right. And remember, I was growing up in the 60s, and there was an election every second month. I mean, and the Ottawa Valley was a very political place, let me tell you, and it was a very oral place. I just remember there was a provincial by-election here in 1962. There was a provincial general election in which a cousin of mine won that by-election. Another cousin running for the Conservatives, Paul Yakubuski, beat him, Leonard Quilty, in the 63 general election, and was there, very popular, very successful Conservative MPP for the next 24 years. So provincial general elections in 63, 67, a federal election in 62, 63, 65, 68. There was no television in our part of the world. We didn't really get television until the mid-1960s. So the best entertainment around was the traveling election show. The major parties, the Conservatives, the Liberals, federally and provincially, they would put on a first-class vaudevillian performance. I don't ever remember very many of those meetings not jam-packed to the rafters. And I'd go with my grandfather, despite my mother's concern. I'd say, who is that up there? Oh, that's Mr. Pearson. Oh, I said, oh, he's the leader of the federal opposition. And I remember we were playing baseball when he showed up in May of 1962 during the last week of the campaign. One of my best friend's fathers was our Liberal candidate. And this guy, Mr. Pearson, walked away from the crowd. He came over to the Little League Diamond, which was right beside the Catholic Church hall, and wanted to throw baseballs around. Well, we thought, no, I don't know who this guy is, but that was something. On the other hand, you had the local conservatives. There was a family of Maloney's. Arthur Maloney, the great defense lawyer. His brother James A. Maloney, our local member, Minister of Mines. Really colorful, very dynamic speakers. Joe Green, a federal minister of agriculture, had a kind of a Lincoln-esque quality about him. Made a famous speech at the 1968 leadership race. So it was a very political environment. And I just happened to have this wonderful entree because, somebody had to go to these meetings with my 90-year-old grandfather. So why couldn't that be me?
That's great. All right. I have one last question for you. I wondered if you can recommend a book or books of Canadian history to someone who would like to learn a little bit more about history of Canada.
Yes, I'm going to recommend two books by the same author, Christopher Moore. They are not recent, but they're very, very good. The first one was published, about now 30 years ago. And it's how they made, 1867, how the Fathers of Confederation made the deal. And the second one is a bit antecedent to the 1867 creation of Canada, the Dominion of Canada. It deals with the really important Quebec Conference of 1864 that laid the foundation for what became the British North America Act, the 72 resolutions that were worked out over whatever it was, 2 weeks in Quebec City in February of 1864, basically became the British North America Act with some adjustment. And what I like about Chris is such a talented guy, is he takes you through complicated things, but you see it through the lens of participants and not just the men folk, because many of the principals brought their spouses with them to Quebec City, daughters and spouses. And so you get this wonderfully, if you watch any of the Ken Burns stuff in the United States, the films, that Chris Moore, with a very deft touch, takes you through really important, consequential material, which is well presented, but you see it often through the eyes of the actors who were for or against, or just a daughter who's trying to figure out what the fuss is all about. And they're just, one of the criticisms about conventional academic history is it's so boring. It's all about, you can predict the, what is it in an opera? The libretto, is that the script? I never can remember what that is. But these things are very human. I mean, right. You're taught about George Brown. George Brown was a really important player in that Confederation period. He softens up for once in his life because he's in love. He marries the daughter of Thomas Nelson, the publishing house in Scotland, and in newly matrimonial bliss, he becomes almost likable. And I don't want to be too hard on him, but just you think at a critical moment, Canada didn't produce him. He was on the scene, but it was as though he was softened for the compromises that had to be made, because Confederation, people think, and both of these books deal with the Confederation period. My experience with people and students, I teach some of this stuff. You ask them, well, what happened? What was there before Confederation in 1867? Well, most of them sort of say, well, it's sort of a kind of an abyss, isn't it? Like there was ice and snow, and they know individual pieces of it, but Confederation was significantly the failure of the previous constitutional arrangement. Confederation was the fifth effort to organize constitutionally the governance of British North America. And it was the fifth one because the earlier ones failed or, kind of ran out of steam. And you need to understand that. And one of the principal reasons that the fourth constitutional arrangement, the so-called Union government of 1841 to 1864, died, was this controversy over denominational schools. I won't get into that again, but it was like, that was it. We have to find a way out of this or we're going to kill ourselves. So I just like this because for somebody who is not a specialist can take either of these books read them and I think really enjoy them. They should be, one or both of them, they should be a series on public television in Canada, because I think there's so many rich, you got people like George Brown, Johnny MacDonald, Darcy McGee. The latter two have a real problem with alcohol. George Brown would, I don't think, get drunk if his life depended on it. You had, a teetotaling important maritimer like the Premier of New Brunswick, Leonard Tilley. And then next door, you had the Ram of Cumberland County, Nova Scotia, for 50 years, a very important politician. Then the Premier of Nova Scotia, Dr. Charles Tupper. And there was a story, let me tell you. So it's just very dumb. Creighton once said that history is the record of the encounter of character and circumstance. I completely agree with him. And these two books by Christopher Moore humanized that story in a way that gives you the didactic benefit. You learn something, but you think, well, maybe we Canadians aren't as dull and boring as everybody thinks we are.
Perfect. Well, I can attest, I've read both of those books. They're excellent books. One about the 3 weeks in Quebec that led, as you said, to the final agreement, and then the earlier one about generally what was going on in Charlottetown. Excellent books. Thank you for recommending those, and thank you for being our guest today on this episode of History Matters. I enjoyed our conversation, Sean, and thank you very much.
A pleasure for me as well.
If you like what you heard today, subscribe to History Matters on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. You can reach me or the members of the Canadian Institute for Historical Education by email at info@cihe.ca.